Okay, welcome back. We start the last session of our symposium, and I'm very pleased to introduce you Professor Donatella Della Porta, who accepted our invitation. So we really deeply thank her for accepting the invitation to be here in the symposium and to present her talk and then inspire the discussion that will be in the end of the presentation of the students. Just a very quick introduction. Donatella Della Porta is a professor of political science and she's member of the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. And she also leads the Cosmos, that is the Center on Social Movement Studies. Next to the impressive bulk of publications, so she published 90 books, 150 article journals, and among the recent books I would like to recall the most recent ones, Social Movements and Introduction. It is published for the third edition in 2020. Then again in 2020, Can Social Movements Save Democracy? And a German publication, Die schöne neue Demokratie, also published in 2020. So next to the publications, she also directed an ERC project on the topic Mobilizing for Democracy, and she dealt with these democratization processes in Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, so covering nearly the world. And I think this will be particularly interesting for our student presentation that also deals with different parts from Near East, so the Middle East, to Europe, and back then to Rome, that is in the core of Europe. But I don't want to take more time, and I'm very pleased to give her the floor for the lecture titled The Right to the City, Democracy and Participation at the Urban Scale. So please, Professor Della Porta, the floor is yours. We can't hear you. Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, now perfectly, thank you.
Okay, I'm trying to share my PowerPoint, but before I just wanted to thank you for the kind invitation and to say that unfortunately I cannot stay for the whole symposium because of previous commitments, but I've read the reports by the students and I appreciated them a lot, so I hope that during my presentation I can also say something useful for the development of these three important pieces of studies.
Thank you.
Can you see the point now?
Yes, now, yes, we can see it.
Perfect. So I'm going to talk for this half an hour keynote on, first of all, what is democracy at the urban level, and then what is participation, trying to frame it within this rather new approach to the conceptions of the right to the city. So my two core messages when I read the reports by the students, I thought that these 2 points could be addressed, thematized, because I found a resonance in the reports, but maybe they could be focused upon in a more specific way. So first of all, the city, the urban scale as a polis, so as something political. And in this sense, I think that the element of democracy and the political characteristics of the urban space could be developed, and this is something I'm going to do in my presentation. But also the second point that I wanted to stress is that the city are sites of conflicts in several of the students' presentations, there was a reference to inequalities, to transformations that are seen as challenges by the citizens, and especially what I'm going to address is how urban movements and to address the issues. So what I want to say is that the local level is not just, can I say, a space in which there is attempt to develop good administration, but it is also a site of harsh conflicts, and to a certain extent a site in which democracy is developed. But in this first attempt to define what democracy is at the urban level, I want to distinguish between different conceptions of democracy. Because we are usually accustomed to think democracies as institutions, so to think democracy as the local level parliaments, city councils, and the local level government plus the administration. And this is true that it is an important aspect of democracy. But what I want to stress is also that democracy has other aspects than the representative ones. So that democracy is also participation, and that this participation does not happen only within institutions, but also happen outside and help constituting them. But let's start with the representative democracies, challenges and opportunities. Often in discussing democracy at the urban level, some challenges have been pointed at, especially in terms of limitation of scale, and also with reference to the fact that, as in the reports by the students, it emerges very clearly, the local level is considered within theories of dual states as the level in which services are offered. And given the development of our societies, this has meant also a sort of overload of demands at the local level. One of the responses that has been developed is in terms of what scholars of urban sociology have defined as growth machines. So the attempt to acquire resources through a competition at the local level, competitions between cities, to acquire big investments by the state, but also private investments. And this has created a lot of tensions at the local level, so it can be seen as a challenge. Opportunities are there as well. One is related with the fact that the small scale, small is beautiful, is presented as the more appropriate scale for having proximity, and so possibilities for the citizens to know and assess their elected politicians. Also, to a certain extent, problem-solving orientation that in the students' presentations have been pointed at, in particularly under the label of the smart cities, is something that has been seen as an opportunity that has also fueled the possibilities of experimenting with new type of processes. Besides the general challenge that I've mentioned, there are, the specific challenges at the urban level, there are also some general challenges, though. A British scholar, Colin Crouch, in a very successful definitions has developed an analysis of our democracies as post-democracy. So as democracies in which politics and governments, he wrote, falling in the hands of privileged elites, as it used to happen before democracy, have become captured of private actors, while the state has lost capacity to do things that it used to do quite well. So in general, the conceptions of post-democracies has addressed the declining capacity of states, but also local expressions of the states, so in general the public, to address problems. And in this way also to ensure what in the past have been considered as fundamental elements for the legitimacy of democracy, that is citizenship right. And in the reports, there are references to housing, there are references to health, but also education, also integration of migrants and so on, all aspects in which, to a large extent, the state has lost or given up capacity to do things that used to do quite well. In this process, so faced to the post-democratic developments in the definition of Colin Crouch, there have been reflection also on how to address a situation that has been reflected in declining trust of citizens in their own institution. And here I want to refer to another important reflections on the development of democracy by a French scholar this time, Pierre Zanvallon, who has talked about counter-democracy. Apologies for the misspelling. Counter-democracy, so the democracy of control, is, according to Pierre Zanvallon, one of the main qualities for democratic development. It is what has been often achieved through the electoral accountability. But what Pierre Zanvallon stresses is also that in the historical evolutions of democracies, there have been many other checks and balances coming from independent authorities, but also coming from the citizens, so coming from what has been defined as a public spheres and public opinion, but also an organized public opinion in social movements, associations of different types. So Piero Zanvallon wrote that the history of democracy has been for a long time identified with the suffrage, so with the election that became the symbols of democracy. But in this moment, it is exactly these symbols that is more challenged. And so we have to return to other ways of keeping governors and elected politicians accountable that are resonant in particular with the development of urban democracy. That is the creation of these policies, agora, in which the citizens as individuals or in organizations can intervene and develop what Zanvallon has defined as démocratie d'expression, d'implication, and d'intervention. So intervening. In this process, what we could reflect upon is that also other qualities of democracy than the representative ones have been pointed at. And here I refer to a definitions that I've given in my past research of some tendency of both in political theory and in empirical research, but also in the political debate, to thematize the importance of participation at different scale, but also beyond the institutions. The local level, we have neighborhood committees, we have schools committee, health committees, and so on, in which work as sort of schools of democracy. And participation is what make in general decisions accountable and also decisions more legitimate. So besides institutions based on the delegation principle of democratic delegation through elections and so on, we have also to reflect upon the importance for democracy of the creations of public spheres, ones that have been addressed in particular by scholars like Jürgen Habermas, that have pointed at the importance not just of voting, but of talking. So as in the Agora, the importance of creating spaces in which citizens as equal are included in transparent form in a communication processes that, according to Habermas, has been is to achieve the good argument, transforming individual preferences that can be quite selfish into conceptions of the public good. And in the reports by the students, there is in particular the reflections about the importance of territorial type of identifications. And I think that reflecting on social movements is important in order to see forms through which the collective identities are created. Forms through which collective identities are created also in a conflictual way, very often at the local scale, as it happened also in the past with the creation of the nation state. So once again, which are the challenges and the opportunities, this time thinking in terms of participations in the city. So participations in the city, and which means at the local level, has been often criticized as oriented towards localistic type of aims. In fact, the label NIMBY, not in my backyard, has been often used to stigmatize some forms of mobilization. But even beyond that, there are reflections about how to depart from the local scale to construct sort of interlocal, translocal forms of aggregations between cities, often in networks that have been also cited in the reports by the students. Other challenge is fragmentation. So at the local level, we see a lot of protests, a lot of organizations in different forms of associations, but often a main problem is how to ensure that these different specific type of groups are connected to each other into a broader visions of the public good. Opportunities that I want to stress also in the remaining part of my presentations are usually addressed in the capacity of forms of aggregation of citizens to happen at a small scale. So even nowadays, studying the reactions by the citizens to the pandemics, what we have seen has been a development of many solidarity groups at the very local scale, where solidarity is facilitated by everyday contact or anyhow a sort of identification which is easier at the city level than at the cosmopolitan level. Plus, at the local level, often also in terms of participation, there is a long history of innovative experiments. So the innovation capacity at the city level has been exploited, for instance, for inventing forms of participations beyond elections that have combined associations of the citizens with the public institutions in attempt like the participatory budgeting or the forms of participated urban planning that have developed. So these issues of democracy, I want to go in the second part of my presentations into the issues of movements in the city that is hinted at and referred to in also the presentations by the students. So the cities are the scale in which we see protests happening. Of course, protest in the city can also address the national government, can also address international institutions, but it is especially in the city, at the city level, that we see the development of forms of aggregation by the citizens. All the more so in a time in which at the cultural level there has been a lot of reference to the individualization of societies and in which therefore the possibility to aggregate through ideologies at the national scale is reduced. So the city is a location for protest, but it's been also a location for specific type of protest. So castles, you may have met during your research, has been one of the first scholars to thematize urban movements as movements that address specifically the issues of consumptions in the cities, and so that address the problems that have been mentioned in the reports, from housing to transports, from education to integration of migrants. So reflections on urban movements has been looking at the ways in which this type of claims for rights at the local level are interact with a sort of communitarian definition of collective identities, and also with the push towards decentralized forms of participations that we have seen historically in different moments. So for instance, if we look at the institutions in Italy, the 70s have been the decade in which the reform at the local level have introduced forms of participation such as the neighborhood level. More specifically, and a bit later on, reflections on urban movement have addressed what has been defined as Lulu movements. Movements locally unwanted land use. So movements that have addressed in particular the big plan for regenerations of the cities that, according to those who protested, were oriented to increase the monetary value of the land against the use value by the city. So we have movements in the city that address especially sort of collective consumptions. But we have also seen the developments of movements that have addressed what have been often presented as big investments for big transformations, often related with the developments of big infrastructures. In these reflections, also scholars like geographers like Harvey have defined right to the cities as especially oriented towards criticizing the use of the city through competition, through privatizations, in what he sees as the neoliberal developments for the commons and for direct democracy. So, trying to address these characteristics of these movements a bit more in details, urban social movements have been seen as movements that develop social demands at local level. Castells has talked of unionism for collective goods, of claims for collective consumptions. But at the urban level, there is also a process of interactions between these social demands and cultural forms of identification. So the identification in the local community is often created a lot along and around a moment of conflicts that help defining and redefining the essence of the territorial type of identity. And importantly also, these movements have been seen as democratic movements in the sense also of addressing issues of how democracies should develop. And here the claims have been towards increasing citizen participations, but also around more recently the definitions of commons that resonate with the old commons as shared spaces for collective use, and that have been redefined and revisited in thinking especially at the constructions of spaces at the city level, criticizing privatizations of spaces at the city level as well. So this movement tend to address issues that were addressed by the reports, by the students, the type of large-scale renovation projects that have been typical of so-called new urban policies, but also the commodifications of spaces that often has created within the cities semi-private spaces like shopping malls or the private policing of public spaces like squares or streets. And changing urban context also in terms of increasing inequalities. So scholars like Saskia Sassen have defined the large cosmopolitan cities as sites of broad inequalities and large dispossessions that in the report that we have presented have also characterized in particular the cosmopolitan cities through a shift from the gentrification with the occupations of the city centers by the middle classes, often the so-called bobo, bourgeois, bohemian in the beginning, and then the expulsions of workers and low-income groups, But even a step further, the Airbnbifications or the foodifications of the historical centers that have often become also spaces from which even the bourgeois citizens are expelled. So these type of movements tend to grow and be influenced by the changing urban context. And they tend to develop in different forms. So as social movement organizations properly, so as groups of citizens that organize in order to protest against the use of the city that is considered to be as hostile to citizenship rights, but also through specific developments. So alternative economic enterprise have multiplied in the cities, often within alternative sort of neighborhood, but also often spreading to the entire cities with cultural consumptions, but also other type of consumptions. Social and movement organizations in the urban space have also often taken the characteristics of squatted spaces, so-called liberated zones in which the occupations of buildings is a way of reappropriating space that is perceived as privatized, but also of experimenting with different forms of life. And as I mentioned, also the local scale has been the scale of solidarity initiatives that wants to go often beyond charities and spread different visions of society. But also at the local level, we have seen the development of movement parties. Think about Barcelona or Madrid until some time ago, which have been cities that are governed by mayors that come from urban social movements. Ada Colau in Barcelona, but we see that even in countries in which democratic quality is declining, often the mayors of the capitals or the big cities come from activist experiences within social movements and represent a sort of innovative capacity for the citizens themselves. I see that the time is almost over, so I leave a couple of slides for the debate eventually. I want to conclude with these two last slides about changes, about the future. So we have seen these developments in democracy as a representative democracy, but also participation at the urban scale. We have seen how urban movements have adapted to these changes, contesting them often, but also finding the way to construct alternative spaces. What will happen? We have seen that the pandemic has not stopped or frozen public commitment. To the contrary, we have seen that online and offline attempt to intervene within the debate of where our societies has to go in post-pandemic time has multiplied, and social movements and different type of organizations have been quite active in this. What can we expect is difficult to say. Sociology doesn't make prediction, or at least is not good at that. But what we know from past experiences, we can say we live in period of thickened history. So, intense time that a scholar watching the breakdown of the Soviet Union is defined as times so compressed, blaring and fundamental that it is impossible to take it in measure. It is times of changes in which, however, the constraining parameters of politics undergo such fundamental changes that they open a range of possibilities. Mark Basinger says, rapidly shifting assumptions about the limits of the possible. And I think this is also what we will see in our urban democracy. We have seen also with recent movements and recent forms of protest, like Fridays for Future, Black Lives Matter, Women's Collective of Non-Unity Men, attempt to keep the roots at the local level, but also going translocal, and attempt to keep focus on the different emerging problems that with increasing inequalities during the pandemics have boomed, but also to find some intersectional development. To which extent it will be successful is an open question for the next months and years. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for this very, very rich lecture that raises a lot of points, interesting points that I think that they will be debated in the discussion. And just a very quick thought that we take for granted democracy too often. And I think that your lecture really raised the point that we have also to reflect and to think the kind and the shape of democracy we wish, we want, and we are fostering for the future. So I think that you really introduced perfectly the topic that now the students will present, and I will just take a very few minutes before leaving the floor to the students. So the final session of the cities, that was the main topic of the interdisciplinary course of the school this year, deals with the sociality, identity, and cohabitation. So the presentation will be divided into three main parts. And the students, so the speakers that will present the work in representation of all the students and on behalf of the students that are either here or from the distance. So will be Allegra Tonnarini, who will make just the introduction to the topic, and then Flavia Vitale, Filippo Liguori, and Alessandro Moscone will present the three parts of the work. Just concluding, I want also to thank the colleagues Bruno Bonomo and Francesco Saito, who were the responsible together with me of the entire group. And of course, these are only the three names that I quote, but behind them, behind us, there are all our fellows and colleagues of the group who worked on this. So I leave the floor to Allegra for the introduction, and then to the other students. I just ask to the ones at home from the distance who is in charge of sharing the presentation, who probably can start sharing the screen. Ok, thank you very much. So Allegra.
Thank you very much.
Forse è meglio che parli dal leggio, sì. Lo volevi evitare, lo so, ma invece.
L'altezza. Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce our three team works on the theme of identity, sociality, and cohabitation. The deep question of who we are has always produced very different conceptual elaboration, which intertwine sociocultural variables and different perspectives. However, a constant of the identity process is the dialogic dimension of human existence. Even if we discover our identity, we do not construct it on our own. We want to bet on the idea of an open identity, decentralized from itself, projected in an inclusive and welcoming way toward the outside. European modernity has always built the issue of identity on the question, who are you? Producing a strong self-referential reflection. Today, alongside the question about the self, we want to reflect on one's own placement in space and in relation to others. We need to question us about the place we live in, rather than about the characterization of ourselves. Beyond the question of who we are, the question of where we are imposes itself with all its existential force. For this reason, the theme of identity, sociality, and cohabitation is so closely linked to the issue of the city. We started addressing the concept of dwelling or inhabiting. Through the senses, city environment contributes in a positive or negative way to the development of individual and social identity and to the psychophysical well-being of its inhabitants. We decided also to analyze the issue of identity linked to political context. Through the sense, we traveled between several cities which symbolize fundamental historical passages through Europe. Bordered cities, cities of cultures, basic places for law allowed us to study the processes of European development. Finally, we studied the history of three emblematic industrial plants in Rome in the 20th century and the process of deindustrialization of two large urban areas as a fundamental element in the construction of identity awareness among citizens. And now I give the floor to the first speaker, Flavia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and I'm going to start with the first part of our work, the senses of the city. In particular, our research focuses on the role played by the senses in the relationship, between cities and their inhabitants. We started from a broader social perspective, and then we went on to focus on the individual, analyzing how senses play a fundamental role in building the link between the city and the city dwellers. Finally, we analyzed more inclusive city models which provide sensory paths and meet the particular needs of anyone. To start with, we consider Heidegger and Agamben's analysis of the meaning of dwelling and building. According to Heidegger, proper dwelling means building places that let both the natural environment and its human inhabitants express their true essence. Agamben instead focuses on the ethical meaning, suggesting that architects should build homes that are places in which to develop relationships and habits. As one can note, the subject and the environment have often been thought in terms of separation. However, consciousness and external reality have been recently re-evaluated in terms of interdependence. This new paradigm has influenced philosophy, psychology, and also architecture, which are now placing increasing values on the senses. Some architects, such as Stephen Hall or Giovanni Palasma, have effected a sensorial turn to indicate the new attention in the perception of urban space by all five senses. They pointed out that too much importance was given to the visual aspect of space in architecture. With this regard, they began involving all sensorial experience in urban planning. The attention is gradually shifting from buildings as something external and miserable to perception as something impossible to determine but essential for citizen well-being. Exposure to light or the possibility of touching water or entering a fountain, sounds produced by different elements, the smell of some plants are qualities as important as buildings. A sensory design of space overcomes the materiality of what is built, including also people and their actions, aiming to create welcoming environments. The urban environment has physics effects on individuals. On the one hand, sensory perception linked to people's daily life progressively shape an unconscious city, a subjective psychic landscape. On the other hand, to become truly inclusive and welcoming, the conscious city, that is public space, must take the different levels of sensory perception into account. The construct of place attachment exactly indicates the cognitive emotional bond that is established between individuals and their important settings. In fact, according to Scannell and Gifford, this is composed of 3 dimensions, that is person, process, and place. And it offers several psychological benefits. Place attachment is also studied by environmental psychology, which analyzes the relationship between people and environment, including the sensory influences over human behavior. Several case studies prove that senses contribute to the perception of the environment in different ways and show how different settings can influence human health, both as systemic and sensorial-specific pathology. To plan an healthful and inclusive city, the need of people with hypo or hypersensory disorder should also be considered. Sensorial museums and gardens should be included in order to provide enjoyable environments for all city dwellers. In fact, diversity should be valued and respected so that anyone can regain possession of the public environment from a physical and mental point of view. The habitability of the urban environment, seen as the interaction between what is built and those who live in it, depends on the inclusiveness and on the way in which it takes into account the needs of each individuals. In this case, we can take account of the Situationist International slogan, that is, to live is to be everywhere at home. So I yield the floor to my colleague, Filippo, to continue with the second part of our work. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to present the second part of our research. And we addressed the concept of European identity, questioning whether it is possible to identify a specific model of Europeanness. So we can go to the next slide. We started off by examining the objective and teleological model. It is an idea of Europe developed since the Battle of Poitiers, based upon the denial of the other and the affirmation of clear boundaries between the interior, the inside, and the outside. This model is characterized by a strong directionality of European destiny and the identification of common European features unaltered through time. Evidently, this model suffers nowadays many shortcomings due to its self-referentiality. The aim of our research is therefore to question this idea of Europe, dealing with the other both from an external and internal point of view and examining its contradictions. In the temporal dimension, it is even harder to reflect over European identity objectively, and because time gives rise to a series of constructions that might be distracting, making it easy to lose sight of the objective. That is why we faced this reflection in a spatial dimension, traveling in space in search of an identity, just as many young people before us did and do, and you are seeing this journey on the screen. In this case, however, the identity we were looking for was the idea of Europe itself. And against this backdrop, we chose 3 cities as exemplary models to revise the issue of European identity with the purpose of problematizing some assumptions. We first landed in Istanbul. The history of Istanbul is an evolutionary path, taking her from being the capital city of the Roman Empire to being a fundamental urban center in modern Turkey. Turkey. This is why it raises such debated questions around the European integration process. And in Istanbul, we addressed the issue of sharp European boundaries. We acknowledged the shared past that Europe and Istanbul have lived, as well as the challenges posed by their current differences, without being able to conclude whether Turkey is Europe or not. We then moved to Florence, the city of Renaissance, cradle of the artistic theory of perspective, maybe the most iconic idea of Western culture. Emphasizing the Islamic origin of that technique, we coped with the issue of pure or contaminated origin of European identity. In fact, the physical theory behind perspective was curiously not born in the artistic field or even in the European context, but has its origin in the Middle Ages, a few centuries earlier, in a study of optics of the Arabic mathematician Al-Hazen. The theory led to different conceptions of art in the European and Arabic cultures, the former posing image as the foundation of representation, and the latter choosing geometry as favorite way to express the cosmic laws that govern the universe. What is interesting, however, is the fact that both these conceptions hide the common osmotic genesis originated by the constant contacts between the Western and the Eastern world. Finally, we arrived in Nuremberg, which is the symbol of Europe's internal conflict and the beginning of an ongoing evolutionary path. The trial celebrated in Nuremberg was the last remedy for the contradictions that had torn Europe apart in the previous 30 years. And at the same time, Nuremberg was a defining moment in European history, since it represented the beginning of a path to refound Europe, a dawn for a new European foundation based on fundamental values such as human dignity, peace, and liberty. So our research highlighted how complex it can be to find an unambiguous and static concept of European identity. Therefore, we decided to reflect on the Europeanization process instead of Europeanness per se. Europe exists as long as we accept this process as a challenge. For a single European identity to exist, we do not have to go back in time and find a common native trait. It would rather be necessary to contribute to creating a common way of life, continuously shared between people who accept Europe as a challenge. We can think of Europe as a process without necessarily identifying a point of departure and a point of arrival. We can think of a Europe in the making, and here the metaphor of the journey assumes even more significance. But how is this idea a political project and not simply a fantasy or reverie? To answer this question, our journey proceeds and ends in two cities which have a crucial role in the construction of contemporary Europe. On one hand, we visited Strasbourg and analyzed what the European Court of Human Rights does in promoting a collective identity based on human dignity necessary for the creation of a European people, a European demos. The popular legitimization of institutions like the ECHR is key in promoting the birth of a European public sphere and civil society. On the other hand, we headed to Brussels, not as the headquarters of the European establishments, but as an international cooperation center and hallmark of an effort to strengthen a common scientific conscience. Every 3 years, Brussels hosts the Solvay conferences, a series of congresses on the frontiers of physics and chemistry, and it was exactly at the fifth of those conferences in 1927 that the world of science sent a message of unity, cooperation, harmony, and sturdiness with this iconic picture that defined a model for science in the decades to come. In the end, our study taught us to not to interrogate over the ultimate foundations of a European identity, but to think of Europe as a product of sharing and transformation. Making Europe means being on the road, confused and lost, looking for something to find or invent. On this road, cities are the places where we learn and find the most, and the invisible capitals that we have visited are just some stops of the journey we must make. Thank you.
So can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear. Alessandro, yes, please.
So our research is finally focused on Rome and in a particular aspect of Rome, which is the industrial character of the city. So we can say that the industrial development of the city has been rather inconsistent compared to other Italian cities such as Turin and Milan, as we can say that Rome has never had a proper industrial identity. However, if we look at these two maps of the Roman industries in 1810 and in 1925, we can notice a radical change. All the industrial settlements have been expelled from the urban residential center, and there are three macro areas with a marked industrial identity. So we studied the history of three emblematic plants located in two of these industrial areas, which are the Snea Viscosa in Pigneto Prenestino in the eastern suburbs, and the Centrale Montemartini and the slaughterhouse of the Staccio Ostiense in the south along the River Tiber. So we try to answer the following question. How abandoned industrial plants can be reused and how they can play a new role in their urban context. So the process of regeneration of these three representative plants allows us to identify two different models of industrial reconversion. On the one hand, the public intervention and the municipal policies of the area of Testaccio Ostiense, while on the other, surely for Snea Viscosa, the engine of transformation was the citizens' action and their fight against real estate speculation. In fact, at the end of the 80s, it was to be expected that a shopping center would be built in the area of the abandoned Snea Viscosa. But during the work of construction, a fortuitous flood gave rise to a urban lake. So citizens fought to keep the area off property speculation and to transform it into a green area where people could meet each other and socialize. So thanks to this social movement, nowadays the area is an incredible example of self-made urbanism. It is a vivid proof of the citizens' strength of action, which could transform an abandoned plant into a place full of meaning according to the needs of collectivity. So we can observe that social reappropriation allows inhabitants to reuse abandoned plants as their own necessities, making the neighborhood the place where they want to live. However, we must also consider the drawbacks of this model of regenerations, and in particularly, the absence of an official sanction is an obstacle to the achievement of lasting results. So the regeneration of the other two industrial plants differ widely from the process now described. The slaughterhouse of Testaccio, which was closed in 1975, was the object of many efforts of public regeneration. And from 1992, there was an interest from three key institutions, Rome City Hall, Roma Tre University, and the Belle Arti Academy. The Centrale Montemartini, on the other hand, was converted into the second exhibition center of the Capitolian Museum in 1997 by the intervention of the public institutions. And nowadays, the museum is characterized by a unique combination of archaeological findings and the original industrial structure of the plant, which has attracted many locals and tourists. So the conversion of these plants proves that public intervention can effectively breathe new life into an abandoned structure, producing lasting results. However, this model of regeneration does not always correspond to citizens' needs, and always government intervention frequently does not take in account one of the guiding principles of an urban redevelopment, which are the wishes and the needs of people in their everyday lives. So finally, considering the remarkable number of abandoned industrial sites in Rome, we must look for a successful approach for future challenges. And in particular, we would like to conclude with few questions for the discussion. Firstly, how can we combine into a successful model of industrial regeneration the two different experiences we have described. So the social reappropriation and also the public intervention. Secondly, could such a blend between these models realize a real conscious city, taking into account not only cost effectiveness, but also the relationship between people and their environment, and then territorial identity. And finally, moving to a European context, we would like to ask how can democracy and participation at the urban scale can contribute to creating and defining a real European and collective identity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thanks indeed for the brilliant presentation and many compliments for the summary you were able to do from the presentation made in May. So please, I invite the people here and the people from distance to interact, to raise questions or add comments or any kind of suggestion to the lecture of Professor Della Porta and to the presentation made by the student. I think that we have many topics and many suggestions we can do, and we can rise and take from both the lecture and the presentation of the work. I think that if I can make just a very quick comment, we have the central idea of the sense that is to be intended as the meaning, and also as the first part of your presentation, the senses, so the feeling. So I think that the perception of what we are and where and also when we are, I think is quite important. So the perception, and so even the perception as it was explained in the lecture by Professor Della Porta about the issue of democracy, because I think that sometimes democracy depends on our own perception, but I would like to add a question mark in the end. So I just add another question to the ones you put in the end of your presentation. So please, if you have any comment or question, you are very welcome to ask. Don't be shy.
Can I break the ice
of course, please.
I found these fascinating. First, I thought that Professor Della Porta had said that she wouldn't be able to stay, and I'm delighted to see that she's still here. All the more because my reaction to the students was, I would love to have a sense of the interaction between the three groups, because there's the problem of the multiple senses, the problem of identity and process and fluidity, and then of course, the very situated problems of regeneration. And they inform each other, and they inform also, they give a content and a richness to the talk of Professor Della Porta. So these four, her lecture and the three projects really fit together in many wonderful ways. And I'm curious about how all four think about sort of a problem of normativity, but I will stop there, and I'm sure that Professor Della Porta has lots to say. So thank you.
Thanks to you for your suggestion, really.
I just wanted to raise a comment, or to mention a comment I had. And indeed, unfortunately, I have to leave because of previous commitment. But I enjoyed very much reading all the three presentations, and I agree with John that they are really talking to each other. My main comment would be to consider more conflicts, because I think that, for instance, the idea of smart cities is a bit in tensions with something that in some of the reports is very much focused upon, and it is inequalities. So the fact that inequalities, it's not just something that can be addressed through outsmarting things. It is, the city is a political polis, and so I was always doubtful about the idea that through a little bit of new technologies, one could overcome the challenges. And I think that putting them in dialogue, the three reports, it would also be important to reflect about how the proposals of smart cities developed in a moment in which Airbnbification, probably because I live in Florence, so I'm particularly sensitive and see very strongly this type of challenges, is excluding a lot of population from the use of the city. And also in these directions, the fact that one of the main elements of the smart cities is also the use of digital technology. But what we have learned with the pandemic is, of course, the possibilities that new technologies open, but also the inequalities in the use of them. And to a certain extent, also the negative potential effects of believing that people has equal access to technologies. Just to make a banal examples, many governments have relied on digital technologies for vaccinations, not considering that many people do not have access to this type of technologies. And the same is true with a lot of services that have been digitalized in a moment in which it's clearly evident that all the processes that you have studied tend to increase inequality of access to technology. Plus, smart cities also implies with digitalizations a lot of increasing controls and reduction of certain conceptions of public spaces. So I think that this type of interactions between the different reports could also be useful in developing this critical perspective. I'm trying to do some exercise in being present in two meetings at the same time, but I think in I have to leave you. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Congratulations.
Really. Thanks indeed for your suggestion. I think that so if some of the students want to reply about this idea of the conflict, I think is quite important to take into account as a moment either to build or to face the problem, I think, of sociality and identity, because as we know, the problem of identity is sometimes, or we have to say too often, a conflictual issue. So if we start also from the idea, as the students did, of the Arabian origin of perspective, I don't know how some of our even European politicians will be happy to understand and to know that it's not a Renaissance European invention, but it has an Eastern, if not probably, let's say, Arabian origin. So it might be, again, a conflictual issue of this point of identity. So if you want to reply about this addition that I think is an enriched addition to your presentation.
I just want to say that, in effect, conflicts was a sort of point of view that we try to use, especially in managing history and space, and we try to reread our history and the European history, paying attention in conflicts, especially Nuremberg. Filippo said before. I think in the future we have to analyze the conflicts that today obviously we are involved in. And about technologies, I absolutely agree, and I think we need at the individual level also to develop an ethic of technologies that nowadays is really important, I think. I don't know if Filippo wants to add something about the conflicts.
Yes, thank you for the comment, because in fact, for example, in our presentation, we talked about conflicts with a positive attitude, like just looking at the outcome of the conflicts. For example, as Professor Nadali mentioned, in the case of the origin of the theory of perspective, or we sort of jumped the conflicts and just talked about the pacification that came after them. So that's a very welcome comment, because that's something that maybe has been missing from our work. So thank you.
Any other question or comments or remarks, disappointments? So we are open. Since we were starting the last session with the democracy, we are democratic people, so we are open even to demonstration, protest, remarks. So please feel free to make any comment. I think Professor Forrester wanted to make a comment again. Please, you are welcome.
Well, it's not that I don't tolerate silence, but lacking 5 students who want to jump in, I will try one thing. I think Professor Della Porta's suggestion about conflict is crucial, really interesting and important. And conflict, though, of course, is not the end of the story. Conflict has many forms, of course, and conflict then begs the questions how, in more or less democratic contexts, conflicts may be worked out, resolved, managed, handled, evolved. And so I'm taking particular pains not to say erased, but conflicts can be recognized and lived with. And then it's really important to ask, what are the different ways in various communities, various settings, and so on? What are the various ways we have learned and seen that we can live with conflict, for better and worse? I mean, the worst ways of living with conflict are pretty clear, wiping each other out. But there's a whole variety of ways that conflict can be lived with in, I think, normatively desirable and interesting ways. And so what I'm urging is to take Professor Della Porta's comment not as an endpoint with sort of the mere recognition, well, people disagree, here are the disagreements, here are the conflicts. It shouldn't be taken as an endpoint, but rather as an entry to really open up some very rich questions. So conflicts of understanding, for example, are very, very different than scientific conflicts of argumentation. And those also are very, very different from conflicts that we might call negotiations. These all get resolved or worked through in very different, rich ways. And so I'm seconding the suggestion of conflict and taking it as a wonderful opening, though, not as many people hear it as an impasse. Conflict is impasse. Conflict means there's nothing can be done. That's a huge misunderstanding. I think, especially in a democratic context.
I agree very much, and I just wanted to make my last remark before I need to go. It is also about the connection between conflicts and identities that is also relevant with regards to the final questions that were proposed for the discussion. We are just starting a cross-national comparative research on how Europeanizations may happen from below, starting from the city. So the idea is to look at this type of initiatives that within cities tend to address all the problems that you have mentioned, especially problems of exclusions and so on, but to see also how they networks with each other at the transnational level, because as it has happened with cities that have created various networks, the rebel cities, the smart cities, and so on, it happens also with these groups. And so they propose a vision of Europe and of Europeanization, which, however, is a particular one, departing to a certain extent by the official visions that European Union institutions want to give, and constructing nevertheless a collective visions of Europe. With this, unfortunately, I have to leave, but thanking you very, very much, and nice to have met you, and John, also nice to meet you.
Thanks to you for being here, for accepting the invitation, and for sharing with us, both students and fellows, your suggestions and remarks about conflict and democracy. And we do hope to have you soon in Rome, really and physically, not only from the distance. So if we have this possibility, but as you said, it's not only an opportunity, but we take as a challenge to have you here in Rome. So thanks again for your participation and for your lecture and for your inspiring and rich comments. Many thanks.
Thank you, and congratulations to the students and the teachers.
So I think that I will invite our president, Professor Lenzi, and the director, Professor Crespi, to the desk for the conclusion of the work of the symposium. So thanks. Bravi.
So, distinguished guests, it's really a pleasure to be here again in the end of this, I hope, fruitful and a nice symposium. And it was really a pleasure to be at least virtually, both John and Donatella. And thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation, and not only for pushing the discussion and bringing new ideas that for sure will be quite useful, and I would say not only useful but also necessary to push ahead our reflections on this wide topic as the cities in different respects we today analyzed all together. So I am glad to declare closed this symposium of the Sapienza School of Advanced Studies 2021, and I would like to thank again you students for your fantastic participation, the fellow, not of course physically, but in the spirit and the fellow. And I take also the occasion again to remember, as our rectress introduced this morning, that in this room, next November 15, we will have, I would say, the 10th birthday of the school, and I strongly invite you to be present in person. And of course, if there will be the occasion to invite also our guests, they are warmly welcome to come together with us to celebrate this important moment of our school. Thank you very much again.
Recording stopped.